December 1944. Snow blanketed the battlefields on World War II's Western Front. Exhausted Allied soldiers silenced their guns. War-weary generals whispered that the Nazi army was on the verge of defeat. They were wrong. On December 16th, under direct orders from Adolf Hitler himself, the German army launched a brutal surprise attack that caught most of the Allied generals off guard. But not American Lieutenant General George S. Patton.
Patton is one of the few leaders who doesn't count the Germans out, even in late game in December of 1944.
Patton had seen the Nazi counterattack coming and been planning for it since November.
He was very, very intuitive. He was very impulsive, and he was very, very courageous in his choices. He often said, a good plan today is better than a perfect plan tomorrow.
Over the next few weeks, Patton's ability to follow through on his plans would turn the tide of the war.
George Patton was the most brilliant battlefield commander in World War II, actually. He has no equal. He did things that nobody else could have done.
But he also had difficulties working well with others of his peers. And so he's, of all of our World War II leaders, perhaps the most controversial, while also being perhaps the most capable. The American Achilles. If you think of Achilles as the great warrior who was born for war.
In June 1945, General George S. Patton, Jr. came home from World War II to a hero's welcome. He had left for the war a relative unknown, but promised to return either a conqueror or a corpse. He succeeded beyond everyone's expectations, except perhaps his own.
Patton was a patriot, but he also had a thirst for personal glory.
Patton really had this role in mind for himself, and he was going to do whatever it took to achieve that goal.
Here was a man that loved war. He understood in a very, very palpable and true way the cost of war, and yet for him, he just felt that that was part of its terrible grandeur, as he put it. And he felt that it was the arena in which a man could be tested.
By the time World War II broke out, Patton had been longing for a chance to test himself in war's arena for almost 30 years. As a young lieutenant, he had jumped at the opportunity to join the U.S. Army's 1916 invasion of Mexico. They were going there to track down revolutionary leader Pancho Villa and pay him back for attacking U.S. territory. But it didn't turn out to be the adventure Patton hoped for.
Nothing was happening, and it was boring, and it was monotonous, and it was a terrible place to be.
The frustrated Patton decided to take matters into his own hands. On a routine trip to buy supplies, he took a detour to go track down one of Villa's generals and two of his officers instead. Patton and his men found their prey and killed all three of the Mexicans in a ferocious gun battle.
The men strapped the bodies across the hoods of their automobiles and went back to headquarters, and this was really something great that had happened, and the war correspondents wrote stories, and Patton was a national hero for about 2 weeks.
2 weeks wasn't enough for Patton, and the invasion would end before he got another chance to show his stuff. World War I seemed to give him another opportunity to earn the glory he craved. But after just 2 days of battle, his eagerness to prove himself would lead Patton to make a near-fatal mistake.
They were under fire. And Patton kept walking up and down, and saying, they can't kill me, they can't hurt me. And just that moment, then a bullet hit him in the thigh and came out the back. And he collapsed, and he was out of the war.
He felt it was the end of his career and the end of his dream to become a great warrior. He just was tormented with the idea that there would be no occasion for him to prove himself again in battle. And while we can say, thank God for peace, he was very ambivalent about it, to say the least. He wanted another opportunity.
Patton's opportunity finally came when America declared war on Germany in World War II.
This was a time when his fate or destiny was going to come to pass. This was opportunity with a capital O.
In 1942, Patton was chosen to be the first American general to lead troops against the Nazis. His job? To head for North Africa and drive the Germans out of the former French colonies there. All my life, I have wanted to lead a lot of men in a desperate battle, Patton wrote a friend. Now I am going to do it. From the moment Patton and his men hit the beaches in Morocco, their daring exploits thrilled Americans who had feared that the dreaded Nazi army could never be defeated.
Patton led a group of American soldiers and landed on the shores of Morocco. And they took Casablanca in 3 days. As a matter of fact, Casablanca surrendered on the 11th of November, which was Patton's birthday, which he loved.
Reporters on the scene celebrated Patton as a warring, roaring comet, and the rootin'-tootin', hip-shootin' commander of American forces in Morocco. But the men he led into battle just called him Old Blood and Guts. The swashbuckling Patton had given Americans hope that the Nazi army that had overrun most of Europe and swept into Africa could be defeated. And no one had needed convincing of this more than the inexperienced soldiers under Patton's command.
Patton was very blunt, very forthright, and very ferocious in his effort to impart an attack, can-do, killer mentality amongst his troops.
The faster and more effectively you kill, the longer you will live to enjoy the priceless fame of conquerors, Patton told his men. We must not only die gallantly, we must kill devastatingly. The quickest way to get it over is to get the bastards.
He artfully used profanity and promoted a persona that may or may not actually have been his, but it was one that communicated to the soldiers the impressions that he wanted them to have of their leadership.
He had a great deal of energy, he had a great deal of emotionalism, which appealed to men and came across when he met them. But above all, as he said in answer to the question at the time, why do your men like to fight for you? He said, people like to play for a winner.
But even in his moment of victory, Patton's pep talks sparked controversy that would dog him throughout his career. Some civilians and many of his fellow officers were offended by Patton's bloodthirsty language and use of profanity. They complained that Patton, in spite of his success on the battlefield, was an embarrassment to the U.S. Army. For the moment, Patton's triumph in North Africa gave him the freedom to ignore his critics, and he hoped that World War II's next big battle would give him another chance to add to his growing fame. The Allies were finally ready to take the fight against Hitler to Europe itself, ready to take the heavily fortified Italian island of Sicily back from the Nazis. But Patton's British allies still weren't convinced the Americans had what it took to get the job done. When D-Day in Sicily came on July 10, 1943, the British kept the main thrust of the action for themselves and relegated Patton and his men to a supporting role. The English army under General Bernard Montgomery would land on the eastern coast of the island and move north to take the key port city of Messina. Patton and his army were to sail to the island's southern coast, come ashore, and protect the British Army's flank. But once he got to Sicily, Patton wasn't about to let official battle plans or concerns for British pride hold him back.
General Patton ran wild in Sicily. He was supposed to be protecting General Montgomery's flank and rear. And General Montgomery was supposed to get to Messina. But the British bogged down at Catania.
Patton saw his chance to show the British what his Americans could do. First, he pushed his men hard out to the west and up to the north of the island to wipe out the Nazi defenses. Then he turned them around and drove them east towards Messina.
And so Patton ran wild, and he got to Messina ahead of Montgomery.
We win the race.
Patton proved that the American fighting man was just as good as the British. And as a consequence, from then on, nobody ever said any disparaging things about the American troops.
Patton's success in Sicily seemed to make him the top contender for World War II's next big job, commander of American ground forces for the Allied invasion of Europe. But his triumph turned to disaster during a routine visit to a hospital in Sicily. Among the wounded men, he came across 2 soldiers suffering from shell shock.
He was a very emotional man. He wept a lot. He tended to wear his heart on his sleeve. He simply had seen such trauma and such blood in the hospitals that when he came upon 2 soldiers that were not physically hurt, he snapped. He simply exploded at the sight of them and struck them. And that was a catastrophe for his career, potentially.
His Achilles heel was his unstable and violent personality, his mood swings. It's almost as if he always felt himself to be embattled and never relaxed. And so the intervals between the actual combat against a known adversary were often marred by combats with those who were supposed to be his friends and allies.
Word that Patton had lost control and struck 2 of his own men in anger quickly spread through the ranks and to the people back home. No one could understand how a leader who was so stalwart in battle could prove so unstable in a moment of peace.
To understand my grandfather, General Patton, I think you have to understand his childhood. He was very, very favored and very, very pampered young boy. Spoiled, certainly, and oddly enough had a lot of traits which we wouldn't associate with the later general. He was kind of insecure. He doubted his courage. He was shy. He was considered to be not a particularly good student, all of which he took to heart and as a lack within himself.
Patton did feel a need to prove himself, and he was very concerned with whether or not he would react to fear as other men did. He undertook unusual experiments to test himself, one of which was while at West Point on a target range, exposing himself between the targets while firing was going on, just to make sure that he wouldn't flinch. He did the same thing off and on at other times and other circumstances. And this self-testing promoted the Patton mystique, or the Patton legend, of being fearless, when actually he was trying to prove himself capable of mastering the fear that he felt.
By the time he slapped the 2 soldiers in Sicily, Patton had spent a lifetime trying to master his own fears and training his men to master theirs.
Patton explained later that he thought he was saving 2 souls by slapping these soldiers back to normality.
At first, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower tried to hush up the incident, but he couldn't, and the howls for Patton's scalp began.
This slapping incident, as it was called, just came across very poorly to the American public, who thought of him as an enormous bully, for having gotten physical with men who were hospitalized.
Eisenhower had no choice but to very, very publicly censure General Patton, and he went from unit to unit and had to describe what had happened and beg forgiveness from his own subordinates. A very difficult thing to do, and yet one of the things that's been said about my grandfather, which I think was very true, he was very prone to offending people, but he was gifted at the art of apology. And on many occasions, the soldiers shouted him down. They would not let him apologize. It's a testament to some idea that his men appreciated him, despite the failing of having slapped those soldiers. I've met as many veterans that have said Patton was an SOB, he was a difficult man, he was rigid, we didn't like him. But at the same time, it seems as if they'll end up their diatribe in saying, but we sure were proud to ride with him.
His men may have supported him, but Patton's superior officers weren't so willing to forgive and forget.
Eisenhower had basically put him in the doghouse to the degree that once they began planning for the next phase of the war, which was the D-Day invasion, Patton was not permitted to be an active part of it, which he desperately wanted, but it simply politically was not viable at all.
Patton was heartbroken when he learned that the job he thought was his, commander of the American invasion force that would go ashore on D-Day, would go to General Omar Bradley instead. The fact that Bradley had been Patton's second-in-command in North Africa and Sicily only made things worse.
Flash. Supreme Headquarters announces Allies begin operations on northern coast of France.
When the long-awaited Allied invasion of Europe finally began on June 6, 1944, Patton learned about it the same way millions of other non-combatants did, from the radio.
The Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. People of Western Europe.
A landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force. This landing is part of the concerted United Nations.
He was going to be in the follow-up forces. And he was terribly afraid that the war would be over before he could get there. And he was really terribly worried.
For weeks, Patton watched anxiously from England as the Allies struggled to get off the beaches of Normandy and into the heart of France. And things weren't going well. The Nazis had the Allied troops pinned down in the fields near their original D-Day beachheads. The Allies feared their bold attack was turning into the kind of trench warfare that had transformed World War I into a bloody stalemate.
And there's genuine concern, because it's horrific fighting, hedgerow to hedgerow, that we may end up finding ourselves in the same kind of situation we found ourselves in World War I, and nobody wants that, because all the anticipation in the war is that we're going to have a war of maneuver. We're going to outblitz the blitzers. We're going to do better than the Germans when we get our chance at this, and they're frustrated.
For Patton, the frustration ended on August 1st, 1944, when he finally rejoined the war as the commander of a new Third Army, an army Eisenhower had put together just to serve under Patton whenever his unique talents were needed most.
There was something absolutely unique and irreplaceable about him in certain kinds of command, in certain requirements of dash and maneuver and aggressiveness and assault. Patton was unequaled. He could be extremely difficult behind the lines. He would say the wrong thing. He would tick off people. But Eisenhower, to his credit, kept Patton around for the right moment.
It was a moment the Germans had been dreading for months.
The Germans regarded Patton as the person they most feared. They had great respect for Patton and great fear of what he was about to do.
Those fears became a bitter reality for the Nazis when Patton and his army broke through the defenses that had held the Allies back since D-Day and charged on into the heart of France.
The breakthrough at St. Lo was a masterpiece of mass, momentum, maneuver, timing, tempo.
Patton is now in his element.
Patton took over in that very fluid situation, a situation full of mobility, improvisation, exploitation. And nobody could have done that better than a man who was attuned to being audacious.
Patton doesn't worry about his flanks. He tells his corps commanders to go in every direction, and they will go in every direction.
L'audace, l'audace, toujours l'audace, as Napoleon said.
They crossed one river after another. They compromised potential German defenses, and this was Patton at his absolute best.
What made Patton great was his ability to see in time and space how to use the airplanes, the close air support, the tanks to further his objectives. He's an incredible tactician. He fights that army very well.
And he would rather surround an enemy, get behind them, go around them, than attack them frontally at great cost of human life.
He had a kind of natural ability to know what it was the enemy was about to do. He transformed that local breakthrough into a theater-wide breakout. And as a consequence, the whole campaign opened up, and everybody was suddenly racing to pursue the Germans who were in full retreat.
By September, the Allies had chased the Nazis all the way to the border of Germany itself. But the race ended when Patton and the rest of the Allies literally ran out of gas.
There wasn't any gasoline anymore for the frontline troops. And so everything shut down. Everything came to a halt. Everything came to a close.
By December, most of the Allied generals thought the Nazis were all but defeated. They were willing to wait out the gas crisis and the winter weather while they made plans for a spring offensive. But all the quiet worried Patton. His instincts told him that the Germans weren't ready to give up just yet. On December 16, 1944, the Nazis proved Patton right. Before the stunned Allies knew what had hit them, the Germans had punched a dangerous bulge in their front lines, a bulge that would give this epic battle its name. They were threatening to split the Allied armies in two and storm across Belgium all the way to Antwerp, a port vital to the Allied supply chain. Eisenhower had to make sure that didn't happen, and at an emergency meeting on December 19th, he turned to Patton, out of all of his generals, to get the job done.
Eisenhower turns to Patton and says, how fast can you attack? And he says, I can go in 48 hours with 3 divisions. And people look at him and say, that's got to be impossible to reorient your entire effort. The effort of your army is supposed to go east, and now you're going to turn it north? And he says, yeah, I can.
He had this all prearranged. All he did was make a phone call from Sedan to his headquarters in Nancy. And he said Plan A or Plan B or whatever it was. He said something like that. And the chief of staff knew what it was he was going to do and did it. So he turned his army from an eastward direction to a northward direction. Now, turning an army of 200,000 men 90 degrees is something that requires a great deal of professional know-how. Really, you have to be an expert in handling troops and handling equipment because you've got not only your supplies to think about, but your communications.
They'll move 100 miles over icy roads, around the clock, and they'll commit on a 20-mile front and begin to erase the bulge that the Germans have created. And it's his personal leadership. He's out there leading the case.
The battle for a little railroad town called Bastogne became a turning point in the war and in Patton's growing legend. Brigadier General Anthony C. McCallum and the men of the 101st Airborne Division were surrounded there. But when the Nazis called on McCallum to surrender, he gave them a one-word answer: nuts.
Nuts. And, Patton hears of this and says, anybody with that much character deserves to be saved. And they will. They'll break open a narrow corridor to Bastogne soon after Christmas and relieve the force there. It's almost the cavalry riding to the rescue. After they erase the bulge, and it'll take most of January, then the American army, with their allies to the north, the Brits, are really ready to go again. And things will begin moving rapidly, beginning in February and March, culminating a race across Germany in April.
The Germans finally surrendered on May 7, 1945. The war against the Nazis was over. But peace in Europe failed to bring peace to George Patton. The great tragedy of my life was that I survived the last battle, Patton wrote. Peace is going to be hell on me. For this American Achilles, there was never enough glory, never enough war.
This was his last war. He had tried to prolong it, but he wasn't able to, and he lost control of himself. He became anti-Semitic in an open way for a short time, for a month or 2 months after the end of the war.
He almost provoked a fight with the Russians. It was a kind of a case study in feeling that he needed more worlds to conquer.
He actually wrote his wife, he said, "It is hell to be old and passé and know it." And he said this a couple of months before the war was over, because he knew that his era, his moment on the stage, so to speak, was coming to an end.
A trip home to Los Angeles in June 1945 gave Patton one last moment in the spotlight, one last chance to celebrate the glory of war and acknowledge its cost.
Your Honor, the Mayor, soldiers, ladies and gentlemen, God forgive me, I love that sort of war. I'm trying to bring back to you what these soldiers have given. God damn it, it's no fun to say to men that you love, go out and get killed. And we've had to say it. And by God, they have gone, and they have won. But I want you to remember that the sacrifice that these men have made must not be in vain.
By the end of World War II, he realized that sending so many thousands of people to die just for one man's glory is unjustifiable, and that he himself had to recognize that the only thing that made these deaths worthwhile was the cause itself. Thank God that he did come to that revelation.
But after just 6 months of peace, Patton, who had longed to die in battle since he was a little boy, would be mortally injured in an automobile accident in Germany. 12 days later, he would die in bed. Towards the end, he was heard to mutter, "I guess I wasn't good enough." Few of the enemies who fought against him, or the men who served under him, would have agreed.
Patton's death, although untimely in many ways, also made him a cultural icon, the great warrior who was born for war and died because there were no more wars left to fight.
It's tragic that he dies the way he does in 1945, but it also suspends in our imaginations Patton is the figure leading the Third Army in achieving victory, because that's what we remember.
This was a man who was made for war, and he really did very, very well. And I, for one, am certainly glad we had him on our side.